Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to the second series of the Call My Supervisor podcast, the PhD podcast for the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. We are delighted to say that after a hugely enjoyable first series last year, the school has let us do it all over again. Once again, this year, we will be speaking to doctoral candidates from one of our departments to pick their brains about all things PhD, from their research and ideas to their revelations and advice. For those of you who are new, my name is Cameron Mitchell-Bell. I'm an undergraduate studying with the Department of Political Economy here at King's College London, and I'm pleased to introduce you to my co-host for this episode, Daniel Mansfield, the Communications Officer for the School of Politics and Economics. Hi, Daniel.
Hello there.
Great, and with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest for this episode, Sebastian Ricketts, a doctoral candidate studying with the Department of European and International Studies. Welcome, Sebastian.
Hey guys, good to meet you.
Okay, so right into it then. So could you please introduce your research title and give us an idea of what it's all about?
Yeah, sure. So the research title is quite a unique one. So it's entitled, Do Crypto Assets Pose a Credible Threat to US Economic Power? So in essence, that's looking at a few different themes. So crypto has obviously become quite a hot topic in the last few years, and I'm looking through a specific lens around US dollar hegemony and how that's been impacted, and sort of more broadly, a few other topics like central bank digital currencies and the impact on US financial markets.
Okay, and could you give us a bit more detail on that in terms of why this subject interests you and what you've come to learn about?
It's a good question. I suppose the professional answer is I'm intellectually curious. I suppose the personal answer is I'm quite nosy. So when I started my more recent jobs, actually, I was exposed to when Facebook was trying to enter the UK market and launch its Libra coin, and then it became DM. So I was in a way at the forefront of that with other colleagues. And as time progressed, you sort of go down the rabbit hole of doing more and more research around the subject area, and it ties in with quite a few different areas, so like politics, economics, law, essentially. And I suppose if we go for the academic lens as well, it's the whole Susan Strange states and markets debate. And that's the lens I'm really looking at it through. And then I suppose in a sort of more real world essence, I suppose everyone knows what a Bitcoin is, but I don't think that people make the distinction between the different types of crypto assets and the impact that they potentially have on, markets, people's, states, etc. So that's really why I'm interested in it.
Okay, could you give us a quick rundown of cryptocurrency for those people who aren't familiar with that? What is it, and what is the relevance of it in terms of financial institutions today?
I suppose in a very broad sense, crypto assets use cryptographic technology, and then there's sort of a spectrum of the different types. So if we go from one example, you have something like stable coins. So that will be a crypto asset which is linked either to a commodity or fiat money, so like British pound, US dollar. And the idea is it's meant to be stable, so it's in the name. You have on the other end of the spectrum something like a general crypto asset, and that could be anything from like a Dogecoin to a Polkadot, and they all have different white papers sort of indicating what they're meant to be used for. And then somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, you have stuff like non-fungible tokens or even central bank digital currencies, which are meant to be a, digital representation of cash, depending on the model of CBDC. So it's quite a broad spectrum.
Sebastian, this is such a fast-moving area. We had the Bank of England recently discussing its own digital currency. Coins come and go. You mentioned Dogecoin, but every week there's a new coin. Celebrities are launching NFTs. How does that impact your research? Because when you come to one conclusion, presumably anything can change. Is that difficult?
Yes, in a short answer. I think the lens that I'm trying to look at specifically is economic power. So if we just take a step back, what I mean by that is, since 1944, essentially the international monetary system's been, developed in the lens of US interests, and within that there's a lot of structural power. So whether or not it's liberalism or different institutions or the role of the dollar in both trade and foreign exchange, I'm looking at those lenses. So if I take one example, I'm specifically interested in how stablecoins have impacted dollar hegemony. So obviously US dollar, everyone uses it for trade, currency exchange. the sort of hypothesis or the sort of question there is, do crypto assets, are they eroding the dollar's influence? Because you'll see a lot of, jurisdictions adopting crypto as legal tender, for instance, for all sorts of various reasons. It can be to try and reduce their dependence on dollars. It could be, to the sort of more nefarious means, such as sanctions evasions or stuff like that. So I suppose that debate's fairly constant. Whereas, developments in the sort of broader crypto market are, fast-paced, moving all the time. That would be quite hard. So this is something I need to sort of work out while I'm doing my research, is just fix on a specific either time period or theme.
What about your methods? What sort of methods are you using for your research? Is it qual? Is it quant?
So there's a few different aspects to it. So first is obviously discourse analysis. So I'll be looking at documents produced by, firms, US agencies, etc., and try and get a sort of narrative on what the debates are. In terms of data, that's quite an interesting one because there's two parts to that. So you'll have traditional financial market data, which is quite easy to access. So, number of dollars in circulation. I'm sure the Fed has God knows how many pages on that. The BIS produces a lot of research as well. But it's the actual crypto asset side of it which becomes slightly more difficult. So in the ecosystem, you have on and off-chain data. So on-chain data is what you will see in the public domain, and that's normally held on the blockchain. Whereas off-chain tends to originate within, say, a crypto asset exchange, and it's not necessarily visible. So you'd have to actually request the information from a firm in order to see it. And I think just a broader point as well, unlike traditional financial markets, which have been around for centuries, crypto asset markets are very much new. So there's not that sort of standardization at present, in my view. So, that presents a sort of challenge from that perspective. So, yeah, I think those are the sort of main ways I'm going to sort of conduct this research. And obviously it's going to be a case study, so that limits how I can use it in other contexts. But, I think the US is quite a good example to look at.
So what could be the wider implications on the geopolitical landscape, especially concerning the United States with regards to the adoption of crypto assets?
There's a few different lenses you could look at this through. So if I just rewind to when I was doing my master's, I wrote about the challenge of China, the US economic power, right? And I think that's the mainstream debate. Everyone looks at US, China, and then more recently, the BRICS and how they're trying to form a currency union to move away from the dollar. I think if I were to speculate, I think crypto assets is just another dimension to that broader debate, in the sense of to some of the points I've already mentioned around trying to either evade sanctions, reduce dependency on the dollar, or if we look at CBDCs, for instance, a lot of countries which are implementing those are developing nations. And in my view, if I put my economist hat on for a second, government or central bank money is one of the safest forms of money. So if you have an ability to transmit that directly to an individual or to institutions, your financial system is relatively safer, or it has a better chance of, transmitting money to where the parts of the economy which need it.
How have you familiarized yourself with the processes of blockchain, of Bitcoin, or of mining? Is it taking a lot of background research? Have you sort of grown familiar with it as you've gone through your studies? What's that process been like?
It's very much been a sort of learning on the job process, if I'm honest. A lot of institutions like Cambridge Alternative School of Finance produces quite a lot of really good literature on this. YouTube, I think most people will know that MIT publishes quite a lot of courses. And Gary Gensler, who's the current head of the SEC, he's got a load of lectures on there. So I've been watching those during the course, getting refreshers, etc. I think that's the sort of practical stuff I've been doing. And then also with my day job, it's just talking to people constantly. I generally have a view that you shouldn't be so fixated on an idea. It's important to go and talk to people and actually test your assumptions, because sometimes people will disagree with what you think, and it's important to have that feedback mechanism, both in the academic world but also in the sort of professional environment. So it's a constantly changing and learning process, really.
Where are you at in terms of your progress in terms of completing a PhD? At what stage are you at?
So I'm 8 months in currently, and it's been a journey, put it that way. Very enjoyable one, but I think, as a lot of PhDs have mentioned previously on this, you never expect what comes up in the way. So yeah, it's been fun though.
Anything in particular stood out to you so far? Is it in terms of the actual research you've done? Did you go in with the expectations that you still have, or have you completely defenestrated your ideas that you had before?
So I was having this conversation with Scott, who's my main supervisor, and I think one area where I've changed my views is on the role of stablecoins. So going into this program, I was of the assumption, stablecoins are really weakening US power. But actually, the more my thinking has gone along and the more I've read, I've actually switched my view. I actually think they're reinforcing it in certain aspects. Because if you look at the backing assets of a lot of the major stablecoins, they are apparently in dollars. So what does that tell you? If you're in a developing country, you're just using the stablecoin as a mechanism to get dollars. So it doesn't really change the end result, right? People want dollars. It's just another way they can do it, perhaps.
So with a lot of the PhD research projects we have heard about, there's been a lot of background literature, supporting studies, philosophy, all these sorts of things that have helped people underpin what they're doing. With Bitcoin and tokens like this, is there that sort of underpinning information, or is it just rapidly evolving in terms of the literature that's out there, and you have to sort of really keep your toe in the know, as it were?
In terms of the literature, I would probably say there's two real broad areas. So there's research which looks at traditional financial markets and is applying that to crypto assets markets, obviously taking into account certain nuances like crypto asset exchanges where they perform multiple functions, whereas in traditional financial markets, we have, in most countries, rules and regulations where those are split. So that's sort of one bucket. And then in terms of other areas of the ecosystem, which I'm slightly less familiar with, you have sort of decentralized finance, which is quite new. So there's sort of smart contracts, etc., in another bucket. So I would say those are the sort of the two pillars really of research.
So in your opinion, overall, what do we need to be thinking about in terms of the factors that contribute to determining whether crypto assets actually threaten US hegemony in terms of the relevance of the dollar?
I think like most things in finance, it goes down to the use case. Like, why are we using this particular service or product, right? I think again, I've mentioned this before, but my views are that in certain aspects, crypto is actually probably strengthening US power within the global economy. And then in other aspects, perhaps the sort of broader ecosystem, it's disrupting, but I wouldn't say it's threatening. I think there's a sort of bigger picture debate around China and the BRICS and other emerging economies, which are perhaps a more credible and imminent threat, if I say that.
How are big institutions, central banks responding to this as you've seen it so far? Are they moving quickly? Is it wait and see? Are they waiting for the Fed to move? Are they waiting for things to change? What's been your perspective?
So it's quite cool, actually. So if you look back a couple of years in March, I think it's March 22, the Biden administration obviously published its executive order, and it's essentially, in their words, I would say, paraphrasing, a full government approach to digital assets. So what they wanted to do is produce a number of reports trying to assess the opportunities and risks associated with digital assets. And I think with the pretext of trying to maintain US leadership in that particular area. I think if you look at sort of what's been happening in the US as well, there's other developments as well. So the SEC is primarily taking an enforcement-led approach towards this market, which is, pretty well documented. And that's because it has existing securities law, which is the Howey test. So in essence, that has like 4 elements. So it's an investment of money, expectation of profits, common enterprise, and efforts of others. Those are sort of the 4 criteria. And in their view, certain crypto asset activity meets that threshold to be classed as a security, right? You then have the CFTC, which will look at it through a lens of, is it a commodity, through the Commodity Exchange Act. And then in parallel to that, you have all the politicians talking about, okay, right, they've got all this going on in the market. Who is really responsible for it? So that's sort of a whole political debate. I think if you take the sort of broader international picture, you have three buckets. So you'll have those who believe they have existing regulatory perimeters, those like us in the UK, which are in the process of, making a regime. And then you'll have the other bucket, which is, don't like it, we banned it, done. So that's the sort of three categories, I'd say.
Sebastian, in terms of your research, how do you measure or quantify whether Bitcoin or e-currency is impacting the dollar? How can you say, yes, it is, no, it isn't?
Something I did in my master's was look at market share of a currency. So when I did my master's, I looked at the US dollar as a percentage of Forex, and I compared it to, say, the Great British Pound, the renminbi, Canadian dollar, all the sort of big IMF currencies, right? That's the line of thinking I'm going down at the moment. But I think the sort of one issue I have is in terms of market size, right? I mean, crypto as a whole market is around $1.5 trillion compared to, traditional financial markets. So it's just a very small proportion of what's dropping the ocean, isn't it, really? That's the line of thinking I'm going down. It's something I do need to explore a bit more. Because I think one of the key issues I'm struggling with at the moment with my research is, how do you actually define power in a credible way? And it's very subjective. I mean, you can, like I've just mentioned, you can use that sort of proportion of trade or FX and stuff like that, but requires a bit more thought.
I ask this regularly of our guests. Have you had to learn anything? Have you had to teach yourself coding, for example? Have you had to brush up on, I don't know, economics? What's anything like that for you?
Yeah, it's quite funny. So we were talking just before this started around my undergrad, and it's in economics. And I've not been it's a quite funny way to say it, proper economist in a long time, right? So for me, it spent the first couple of months just brushing up on the theory, actually. And then in terms of coding, that is one on the to-do list, but for another day.
Okay, good stuff. Well, Sebastian, thank you very much for your sharing your details of your research there. That's going to be the end for part one. We're going to take a short break now, and we will see you all again for part two, when we'll talk a little bit more about Sebastian's personal experience of the PhD.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the mid-segment of the Call My Supervisor podcast. This round is called Thesis Thunder, and we aim to explore the most exciting and groundbreaking doctoral dissertations in politics and economics. I'm here with my amazing co-host Clara, and we're here with some fascinating works of the intelligentsia from our domain. So today we're immersing ourselves in a compelling dissertation by Elena Pupazza from the London School of Economics 2021. The thesis lays out the intricate details of the electoral consequences that come with demographic changes. So, Chapter 1 delves into the realm of pension reforms and extended time lags. The study unfolds how mishandled policies coupled with delayed information dissemination lead to gradual erosion of political trust. In a departure from conventional understanding, the research uncovers a type of voter sophistication where affected individuals did not punish the incumbent for sacrificing short-term individual well-being for long-term welfare gains. However, a lingering sense of political representation vacuum persisted, potentially exacerbated by governments overlooking the timely notification of policy changes. The key takeaway here is the importance of timely communication to preserve citizens' trust in the democratic process cannot be understated. So Chapter 2 takes us into the fascinating world of hypermobile migration, following the EU's Eastern enlargement. By examining settlement patterns influenced by travel infrastructure, the study sheds light on how spatial predictability impacts support for far-right parties. An innovative instrumental variable, the proximity to travel hubs, emerges, presenting an alternative to conventional shift-share instrument in migration studies. This not only expands the methodological toolkit, but also emphasizes the significance of considering travel infrastructure in understanding migration's electoral consequences. Chapter 3 thrusts us into the post-Brexit landscape, unveiling a significant surge in naturalization applications among EU citizens in the UK. The findings underscore that constraints on freedom of movement rather than bureaucratic obstacles influence the decision to naturalize. The research hints that the political seismic shift in future elections as mass enfranchisement takes center stage. Political actors are urged to pay closer attention to this newfound electorate. And in the final chapter, the lens widens to encompass global challenges arising from demographic shifts. Drawing parallels with climate change debates, the research navigates the policy circle's long-standing discourse on planning for the repercussions of aging populations. The dissertation emphasizes the need for policymakers and the public to grapple with the complexities of policies that transcend election cycles, urging a rethink of existing policy feedback mechanisms. In essence, the dissertation not only meticulously dissects the electoral ramifications of demographic shifts, but also illuminates broader implications for policy making in the face of global challenges. The research showcases the intricate interplay between policy decisions, public participation, and political landscapes, offering an invaluable insight for policymakers and researchers grappling with the complexities of our ever-changing world. So I brought that one specially for you because you wanted to see a more empirical one, and so I thought you'd really like that. So I was wondering what you had to say about that.
I think it's very interesting. I mean, I personally took an economics of the public sector module last year, and a lot of it was looking at how these different public policies can be applied given these different electoral cycles and how they can transcend beyond, one incumbent's electoral cycle, and what the role of partisanship is in formulating these policies. And one of the weeks was on pensions and this idea that we have an aging population, that it's kind of a big shift that we see in the past generations as well, and what can be done to deal with it. So I think it's very interesting to look at the different mechanisms that are at play. I was wondering, what do you think is the main takeaway and the most interesting thing about this paper?
So I was at a seminar with Vince Gable, the ex-leader of the Liberal Democrats, and he made a lot of interesting conclusions. One of them being that Britain lives in this weird, hypocritical and perplexed odd space between Europe and the US, in the sense that we have low levels of taxation, significantly lower than most of mainland Europe, yet we have a higher social welfare than the US, and yet we also have a propensity to resent increases in population via migration. But then the polls are very contradicting on that, in that people seem to want more immigration but less immigrants. We live in this state of just perpetual hypocrisy where we don't seem to know exactly what we want in terms of policy reform, and that's going to obviously affect how we deal with aging demographics. It's going to affect how we deal with labor shortages resulting from Brexit, and there's so many implications for this, which is why I found this paper particularly fascinating.
Absolutely, and I think you can relay findings from this paper to a variety of different dimensions of public policy, of public affairs, of kind of the public domain, whether that be, as you say, taxation, as you say, immigration, and as this paper clearly does highlight, like there's the spillover of this is way beyond just pension and pension schemes and pension policies, and can be applied to many different things.
Absolutely. I mean, do you think it would be possible to get a population like the UK to accept a higher level of taxation? Because it seems like, on the basis of, our cultural significance in the world, we had a massive rejection of immigration when it came to the Brexit vote. And so even though that's been taken up with non-EU migrants since then, people seem to have this resentment towards migration overall. And so whilst they're not going to accept more migrants, or there's going to be a political demand to reduce the number of migrants to come into this country, will there in turn be an increase in the valuing of higher taxes in order to be able to fund the social welfare programs that we have and everything that we do?
I think what you mentioned earlier about this hypocrisy is exactly what we are seeing and we will see. So there's just a rejection of migrants, which, had there not been such a rejection, would have led to higher kind of a broader tax base, essentially. But then also, I think that the UK population is also widely against increasing taxes. So I think that's exactly what you highlighted, a hypocrisy, kind of a tension between the two, and a trade-off that needs to happen, but the UK people are unwilling to happen. And I think that relates to kind of this theory in economic policy where people are not willing to put in more work, but once they see kind of the benefits or the drawbacks of the drawbacks of not putting in that extra work, then that's when they kind of start mobilizing. So until I guess they see some concrete effects to this lower tax base, to kind of a smaller pool for public financing, I don't think that the UK population will care. But if there is more concrete evidence and examples of where these limitations kind of materialize, so say, for example, lower pension schemes, or people having to put off when they retired, given that their pension programs are quite low and insufficient, then maybe that's when people are going to have to wake up and realize that a change needs to be made, either in immigrant attitudes or in being willing to put up more taxes.
Absolutely. The one thing we haven't discussed so far is the first chapter. So I find it particularly interesting that this dynamic inconsistency is created by a time lag in regards to implementing policies. It's a very difficult balancing act because from our perspective, it seems like from a theoretical angle or empirical angle, implementing a policy has, immediate effect. But then from the government's perspective, the timing of when you announce that policy is going to cause conditions to change around which that policy was initially formed. And so by the time people have reacted to the announcement of that policy, they have to either retract the policy or change it in some way. And it's a constant balancing act of whether or not you want to have a particular ideological orientation and policy prescription for the country, or do you want to essentially act more utilitarian and base policy on what the conditions of the country you're dealing with at any given time. And I find that a very interesting thing to consider as well.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily like a specific case with pension schemes or this particular domain of policy. I think that another place where we see that quite often is in, for example, environmental policy. If we look at like the EU ETS, so the emission trading scheme, I think it was quite strategically announced because they were aware of this kind of feedback or this response that's going to have from the public and kind of the shift in behavior. And the way that the EU had approached it and individual member states had approached it was to kind of present it and propose it in one way and then slowly make it more, I guess, quote unquote, aggressive or more stringent. And I think maybe that's a way that it could be presented so that at least it gets a foot in the door, the policy is able to establish itself, and then that can be further developed. And I think once people have accepted the early renditions, it's much harder for people to renounce it completely, or at least it's somewhat already implemented and they being the government have more leeway to kind of adapt it and change it. So maybe that's something that can be adopted in the UK and in the way that they approach different policy dimensions.
Absolutely. No, that's very interesting. And we'd love to know what you think of that at home. So what have you got for me, Clara?
Well, today I'm kind of sticking to the kind of central bank monetary policy theme that I've been going off of since last week. And I'm looking at Fifi Gianmarco's paper at the University of Warwick that was published in 2021, and looking at the left and neoliberalism in Italy post-Eurozone crisis, so looking at 2011 onwards. And it's kind of, broadly speaking, it's analyzing why there have been patterns of more neoliberal policies implemented since the Eurozone crisis, and particularly in the 2 years following, and looking at, specifically fiscal austerity and labor market flexibility in European nations broadly, but particularly the case of Italy. And so, well, historically, this kind of pattern can be explained by speculative markets and institutions or domestic ruling classes. This paper seeks to take kind of a closer look at why we're observing this in the modern era. So it's looking at initially the shift in 2008 to a more kind of technocratic government in Italy, given that EU supranational bodies had implemented the specific policy packages that most EU member states had to adopt, and within that kind of range of EU member states was Italy. And as a result, there was a lot of leftist political factions, unions, and labor organizations that were kind of casualties of the process and kind of drew the short end of the stick. And kind of how has that developed since 2008? And I think that there's kind of a general consensus, or at least intuition, for people to assign and contend a great role to the EU and national government elites for why this has happened. But I think this paper kind of proposes that should not be overemphasized, and that the mechanisms of it are much more intricate than we believe for them to be. And that, there's a number of different things that we've seen, for example, in terms of reforms in the political economy of Italy, such as the Save Italy decree, the incorporation of a balanced budget clause into the Italian constitution, and many more, like the citizenship income and so on. And I think that political economy as a whole is quite subject and vulnerable to a lot of these different, both, again, political and economic pressures. And I think it's interesting to see how this research would develop now with Meloni's incumbency and kind of the rise of populist far-right movements. So yeah, I was wondering what you think about that.
Absolutely. So I have a question for you. Do you think, in light of Greece's, performance within the EU as an EU member state and the rise of far-right parties in recent history, do you think that credit is an inherent right within EU countries, or is it something that we need to take more care of in future?
I think we need to be careful when we use Greece as an example, because I think it's quite widely accepted that they did fudge the numbers when they did apply for Eurozone accession, or even, for Eurozone accession. So I'd be cautious of using Greece as an example. But for example, if we're looking at Romania potentially joining the Eurozone in the next couple of years, clearly economically it's quite weak compared to, say, France or Germany. And I think you're raising a good question. I think that it's part of being part of this camaraderie, or like this camaradereship, or this kind of like collection or collective collaborative network of states. So I think that it warrants a closer look, and I think the way we can take a closer look is by looking at the accession criteria, looking that it's sufficient enough, but it shouldn't be so strenuous that weaker or economically poor countries are unable to join into this kind of exclusive network of countries, because ultimately it is supposed to make it easier for countries to work together, and also to be able to pull out quote unquote economically weaker countries out of this weak state and be able to bring it up to the level of most, or the average EU member state. So I think that while we should and can make the convergence criteria a little bit more strenuous, we need to agree and accept that the EMU, the European Monetary Union, is both a political and economic project. So it shouldn't be done in a way of like optimal currency area and following that criteria to make sure that all member states are at the same level, and no one's going to have to put in a little bit more work to help, a weaker, again, with quotation marks, a weaker country, as much as it's also a political project, and we need to kind of accept the benefits that come with having more member states within this tight network of countries that can work together.
Absolutely. We don't want to consider the EU monetary union in the same way that IMF is often contemplated by left-wing thinkers. I mean, you mentioned leftist factions, what they're saying about this. It's a common argument by leftists that IMF loans are, in a way, exploitative, because developing countries where the majority of studies for economics and economic development and sustainable development are not based. Most of the studies are based in the West. So when these countries are developing and exploring new forms of government and structure of social organization, the IMF is saying, well, we don't really want to loan to you because this is kind of an experimentation. This is untested. And leftists are saying, well, this is exploitative because you're saying, oh, the West-centric version of what a government should look like and the role of the state should look like is the basis on which loans and credit is issued to countries that want to develop. And so we don't want to create a similar situation where, just because there might be some political institutions or ideologies that we don't agree with within Europe, that is weaponized, if that makes sense.
But I think another thing with the EU in specific is that to be a Eurozone country, you need to be already a EU member state, right?
Yeah.
And the criteria to be an EU member state is already quite rigorous in terms of what norms and values they need to meet before accessing. So if we look at, for example, a country like Greece, it had to undergo significant democratic reforms, significant kind of shifts to their structures, to their political competition arenas, and so on, for them to be an EU member state in the beginning. So then the EMU is not necessarily so much as like the IMF, which is a certain like norm-based membership, but more so an economic membership. So again, I think that's where they diverge, where the IMF seems to be trying to incorporate values and norms to its economic agenda, I guess, whereas the EMU, the political side and norms and values, democratic criteria is already incorporated in its just general EU membership. I think that's where they diverge as well.
Very interesting. So what was it about this particular study that drew you? Because I'm guessing you mostly were looking at monetary unions for your search for theses or theses. What's the plural of thesis?
I think thesis.
Thesis, yeah. So what was it about this particular one that stood out to you?
Well, I think I think that in the last session we were talking about the European Central Bank and talking about this kind of shift to technocracy. And I think that all relates to kind of the broader debate of like, where does the ECB stand? What kind of power should be assigned to the ECB? How should it be governed, and so on? And I think this is kind of an extension of it, right? Like there's two sides to it. Is the ECB overstepping its boundaries? Is it kind of restructuring and reforming individual member states to kind of in kind of a long-lasting pattern, long-lasting shift, especially post-2008, where we saw kind of an EU intervention that was unlike what we had seen before, especially with the austerity packages that it enforced and so on. And kind of what role should the ECB or the EMU or just EU supranational institutions have in individual economies and political economies? And I think that it's interesting to observe kind of the interaction of the EU's supranational bodies with national authorities, like in Italy. And I think that sometimes it creates tension, sometimes they work complementary. And I think when they work complementary is when we see this kind of persistent pattern, like what we might be seeing with neoliberalism and leftist policies in Italy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty widely promoted narrative in Italy that their economic woes with regards to unemployment and stagnation are down to the lack of control over monetary interest rates. That's the word.
Yeah.
That's the thing I was thinking of. And so, yeah, I guess it's very interesting to consider. So, I guess what would you say from this going forward in terms of theses that could result from this, or like what is your main takeaway?
My main takeaway is that we should not overemphasize the role of the EU in kind of these shifts. I think the EU is playing a big part, but it's not the only one, right? And I think that it's easy for the EU to be a scapegoat. It allows for national political actors to look at a different, completely separate body of political actors that are either creating these economic downfalls or these economic consequences. So I think, one, we should be wary of the role we assign to the EU, and especially in negative situations. And second, I think it'd be really interesting to kind of develop it further to now 2024, when we see Meloni and the far right kind of take office, and see how that changes in terms of neoliberalism in the political economy of Italy.
Okay. And now we will pass over to the second part of the Call My Supervisor podcast.
And welcome back, everyone, to the second part of the Call My Supervisor podcast. In the first half, Sebastian told us about his research and the areas of cryptocurrency that he's looking into. And in this half, we're going to be talking about his personal experience of the PhD. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cameron for the first question.
Amazing. So what attracted you to do a PhD?
It seems like madness anytime someone actually wants to do a PhD, but I suppose it's curiosity and actually trying to have a bit of substance to what I do in my day job as well. I mean, I love what I do, but I wanted to go that level deeper as well. And I thought this was a kind of practical way of doing that, as well as, you hopefully get a doctorate at the end of it. So that's the main reason, really.
I asked my last guest about the Dunning-Kruger effect, if they think it's kind of depressing that you learn more and you feel like you know less. I'm only doing a bachelor's degree, and that's how I feel, which is kind of, it's kind of an unfortunate aspect of it, because you want to be coming out of it as, yes, I have the answers now. And obviously, I don't know if that's something you relate to specifically with regards to your PhD.
I mean, if I was going to get really philosophical about it, I suppose, when do you ever really know everything, right? You're always learning something, right? I suppose the PhD is just a formal way of trying to explore one strand of something. And then even when you get to the end of that, it will probably change. So you just keep going and going. So I never worry about that as such. It's just more the next phase of my development, if you call it that.
Is there anything different about the process that differed your expectations?
I mean, I've been going onto campus sort of semi-regularly, but it's quite difficult as a part-time student. Everyone's there constantly focusing on their research, whereas I'm kind of dipping in and out. And also there's an element of trying to prioritize your time, which is quite difficult as well, particularly if you're knackered at the end of the day and then you're like, okay, I need to switch gears and, do a load of reading or, try and write some words in a document. So I suppose that's one aspect, really.
I think you are the first part-time PhD that we've spoken to. So I'm going to pick up quickly there. How doable is it? How possible is it? And how does it differ? You touched on it just there, but how does it differ from a full-time PhD?
I think there's a couple of things, and I can come on to this later, but when you're picking your topic, I would always say to people, think about very carefully how it aligns with your interests or what you enjoy reading about. So I'm quite lucky in the sense of what I do day to day is very similar to what I research. So from a mental perspective, I don't have to make great leaps, because that's when you get people really they really underestimate mental tiredness. Everyone talks about physical tiredness, but mental tiredness is something completely different. So that's one aspect. The second thing as well is just trying to immerse yourself in student life as well. That's quite difficult. I was having this conversation with someone the other day, and I think something I really enjoy about it is you can go onto the Strand. Sometimes I sit in Bush House or Strand campus, and you can just think about ideas in your head relating to your research. Whereas, perhaps if you have a professional job, it's constantly like deadline, deadline, deadline. And I'm not saying you're not thinking, but, it's very outcomes focused all the time, right? So I suppose that's the differentiation there.
So do you find any particular aspects of it stressful? And is there anything you do to unwind to that, or anything you go to immediately?
So it's kind of handy having a job. Like a lot of the PhDs don't. They're either TAs or just doing it full time. So I suppose the way I unwind is travel, actually. So I'm quite strict with myself. I would say I need to write 1,000 words or read X, Y, or Z things before I can go and do something. So that's my very strict way of, having milestones, breaking up my work. Again, talking about this before, I'm a giant Arsenal fan, so I don't know if that's relaxing or not. Probably not, but I like to watch Arsenal. And at the moment, Six Nations is on, so that's always a good, way to sort of de-stress and think about other things other than work or PhD. But I think fundamentally, you can't let your PhD engulf you and become your personality. That's something you really need to guard against.
What challenges in particular have you faced so far? Is there any moment where you've felt like this is something that's going to be more difficult than you thought, or have you felt basically up to the challenge equally the whole time?
I think, like anything new, it sometimes puts you outside your comfort zone, right? And it sounds a bit corny, but it's kind of a privilege to be able to be testing yourself constantly, right? Something which I found challenging was I started in June, and in September I had to change supervisor because my supervisor I'd been talking to found a different role at another university, which, no grudges against them, but, I'm quite pleased with them, actually. So that was a challenge. I remember just going into induction and having a conversation. I go, "Who's your supervisor?" I said, "Oh, he goes, "Oh, yeah, I need to talk to you about that." And I was there, and I've got to the age now where I just don't let things bother me as much anymore. I went, "Oh yeah, okay, great, right, another one to do." So that's one quite fundamentally challenging thing. And then I think other things are around just making sure you carve out time to do the actual work and reading, really, because that's fundamentally what you're doing. It's not like, for example, UCAM doing an undergrad where you've got quite a set, structured timetable. I'm fully grown adult with a job trying to do research on the side, right? So it's, it is quite challenging in that respect.
Is there a particular resource that you go back to again and again that's been particularly useful for you? Like, for example, GitHub or something for on the more programmy side, or there may be something that's particular to you?
So I don't know if you can tell this already. I'm more of a talk to people sort of person than just, reading things constantly. So I'm quite lucky in the sense I've got a couple of friends doing PhDs at different institutions. So I've got one at, across the road at a uni we won't talk about. So I go and talk to Lawrence quite a bit about that. A friend at work, Jeff, is doing his as well. So that's always good to bounce ideas off. And then my aunt is actually a PhD. So she's a clever one. So I can, different subject, but I can ask her as well. So I'm more in the sort of field of talking to people. And then if there's anything I learn, I'll go away and research it. So that's just how I tackle it, really.
How do you find talking to other people in the PhD community? I was speaking to my seminar leader recently, and she wanted to know about this guy I met in a hostel a while back who was talking about his PhD thesis. These two don't know each other at all, but she was like, "Oh yeah, give me his details. I want to know." Do you find that's something in common with all doctoral candidates?
I really like the community, actually. Always make the effort to go onto campus to see people, go for socials, etc. But it's quite funny. Everyone seems to be doing right-wing populism or some form of, that study where I'm the outlier as the sort of crypto bro, if we want to call it that. So I suppose you can have sort of common discussions around methods, how you're approaching your research, but when it comes down to the actual topic, it's quite difficult. So that's when you kind of need to be proactive and go outside your immediate community. So, leverage people in your network, or just, as you just mentioned, just try and do some independent research. So it's a bit of a balance.
I actually have a pretty unique question with regard to that. So some people have made the claim that academia in general these days has a certain tilt towards whatever the social or political milieu might be, and that unfortunately influences the type of research that comes out. Do you find that to be problematic at all, or do you think it's something that can be improved on, or is it, yeah?
So I thought long and hard about this, actually. And I don't think it's an issue if a particular individual has a leaning towards one particular idea. And that, again, that's down to your personal discretion if it's right or wrong. I think what is more actually important, and I think it's lacking generally these days in a societal level, is the actual ability to go and talk to people you disagree with and have a constructive conversation about it. So it goes back to your point around, the conversation I had with Scott. Now, Scott's a very reasonable, brilliant bloke as my supervisor, and he challenged me on an idea, and I went away and thought about it, and I went, yeah, I see what you're saying, and that changed my thinking, and that was quite a constructive type of engagement. I think what's counterintuitive is when you're so hardline in a viewpoint and there's no flexibility, that's when it becomes an issue. And I think just to overlay all of that, my job, both as a professional and as an academic, is to be objective, right, and look at the facts. So I think that's just important to state, really.
You've listened to a few of these podcasts, so you'll know this is something that comes up again and again. But I just want to touch on loneliness. I think this may be less of a problem because you said you're surrounded by people that have done a PhD and family as well. But do you have an insight into loneliness and the PhD study process? Does it seem like an issue to you?
Yeah, I think you can always feel lonely, can't you, in any walk of life, right? I think I've seen this with, the people I talk to. We have a saying in one of my football teams, they've gone black ops, right? Which means they've just gone, they've vanished. You haven't heard of them for ages, and then they reappear suddenly. And I think, when you sort of talk to them post when they've been doing writing for 2-3 weeks, there is an element of loneliness because it goes back to Cam's question. Like, you question yourself constantly, am I doing the right thing? Is this a good idea? Is this rubbish? What are they going to think? So I think that probably plays on people's minds quite a lot. And then I think your role either as an academic colleague or a friend is just to be there to listen, not necessarily say you're right or you're wrong. Because I think that's what loneliness really is feeling like you're on the journey on your own, actually, as opposed to people around you.
Overall, what advice would you give to someone who's looking at doing a PhD?
I would say, I think first and foremost, take your time. So why do you want to do it is a fundamental question, actually. I mean, you can also always start off with the good intentions of like, yeah, I'm going to do a PhD, but actually, why are you doing it? Where's it going to lead you down the road? Do you want to be in academia? Do you want to use it to complement your professional experience, or are you just interested? I think that's your fundamental questions. Obviously, the funding and stuff, people need to go along their own routes and determine if they can afford to do it as well. King's does some brilliant scholarships, the LIST scholarships, all sorts of research councils, etc. I'm not an expert, but you'll find it if you Google it. And also student loans. And then I think the institution is important, in terms of, do you see yourself at this institution? Why do you want to go to this institution? So I really like King's because it's, world renowned. It's a very good location for me. It's just around the corner in terms of, Temple. So I can walk across Waterloo Bridge and feel inspired as I'm going to campus, if we want to put it that way. And then also, this is very underrated, but very important. Or two things, actually. Supervisory team. Spend time getting to know them. I can quite comfortably say I've got a pair of really great supervisors I get on the personal level with, and they're brilliant at what they do. And that's fundamental because I'm writing the PhD, right? But let's not lose sight of the fact that there's a team around me that's helping me on this journey. And I think people like to think, they build things on their own. They don't. There's always people helping you. And then I think the other thing I was going to say, know what topic you want to write about and why, because and what actually it's going to add to literature or whatever, because that's really important.
We've spoken to a couple of PhDs whose topic or the direction of travel for their project has changed as they've gone further through the process. Do you see that happening, or has that happened already in your work?
I don't think change is a bad thing, because sometimes we can start off with this grand idea of, oh yes, I'm going to cover all of these themes, I'm going to change the world, I'm going to do this and that, but sometimes you actually need to narrow down your research focus. The way that I'm looking at it at the moment, I want to do a papers model. So, you'll see in the Biden administration executive order, there's a few different themes they want to explore. That kind of gives me an idea for how I can structure my research. Instead of trying to, it's like anything, you can't be all things to all people. Sometimes you just got to stay in your lane and be like, yeah, this is what I'm focusing on. So yeah, I think that's the approach I'm taking. I did start off with quite a grand idea, but yeah, as the time's gone on, it's got more narrowed and specialized.
It seems with respect to certain fields, not all, but certain fields, it appears to be the case that sometimes edgy opinions and edgy theses, as it were, get rewarded for just purely on the fact that they are attempting to justify something that is outside of what normal or ordinary people would consider to be acceptable opinion on a subject. So there's a lot of theorists who derive not mainstream popularity is the wrong term, but mainstream recognition from having a given idea or a given theory that would, I guess, cause a lot of polarization and would maybe give a bad representation of the field overall, but because they've managed to justify it in a particularly good way, it puts them, steadfast ahead of everybody else. Do you find that's the thing?
You're going to hate me, but it depends.
Yeah.
It really depends. I think, again, not to be too philosophical, but progress requires going into areas which are uncertain or perhaps not fashionable. I think it really does depend on the manner in which you do it, if I'm honest.
Earlier in the series, we spoke to Daniel, who said he gets his best ideas while he's out running. Do you have something similar? Is it running? Are you playing football? Is it chess? Is it, I don't know, Call of Duty? Anything like that for you?
This is one aspect of myself I hate. I'm a night owl. So more often than not, my brain comes alive around 10 o'clock at night, like really alive. And I start thinking about things, and that's normally when I get my inspiration. Or sometimes it's just when you're on the way somewhere and you see something. So, you haven't thought about an issue for quite a few days or weeks, and then something in your sort of environment will just be like, got it. And then you'll be on the tube and someone will just look at you and you'll be like, don't worry about it, mate. So, yeah, I mean, I carry around this, I'd always recommend, this is another good bit of advice, actually. So I've got a little journal, which I do all of my, put all my thoughts down in, actually, for all the academic work. I've got it here. So if something comes to me or I have an idea, I try and scribble it down quickly or underline it or highlight it saying idea, research this, or draw conclusions to what I've been thinking about earlier. So yeah, ideas come at weird times, horribly when I'm trying to sleep. But yeah,
I completely get that. I've got really bad ADHD, so I only I pretty much only function when it's completely inconvenient to function. So it's a miracle that I got as far as I have.
I feel your pain.
I'm going to end on a speculative note. In 25 years' time, will I be paying for things exclusively in a state-backed cryptocurrency or any other cryptocurrency, and money will be a thing of the past?
That's a great question. So I think it would be probably, if I was going out with my personal view, I think it'd be one of many payment mechanisms, actually. You'll see across the world a lot of jurisdictions are actually either consulting or discussing fiat-backed stablecoins. And if you compare that on the spectrum of all the crypto assets, that's probably the one that is most likely to be equivalent to cash. or, representations of money. I mean, you have to think of the characteristics of money in the first instance, right? So store of value, unit of account, so that means it's all the same. Method of exchange, fundamentally why you're using it in the first place, I suppose, in many ways. So as long as it meets those 3 criteria, I suppose, yeah.
So that brings an end to today's episode. I'd like to thank my co-host Daniel for his support, and I'd like to thank Sebastian for sharing his thoughts and insights for this episode. So, of course, thank you to our listeners for taking the time to tune in, and we look forward to welcoming you again for our next episode. Take care.